Okay, so think about breathing for a second. You know, how we do it. Lungs, blood carrying oxygen. Seems pretty standard, really.
Right. Fundamental for us vertebrates.
But then you look at insects, I mean, there are just so many of them everywhere, all shapes and sizes. And they do it completely differently.
Totally different. No lungs at all, and their blood. It doesn't really carry the oxygen like ours does.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. How do they pull it off? How do they thrive?
That's exactly what we're going to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive into insect respiration, specifically their really unique tracheal system.
Our tracheal system, right?
Yeah. We'll look at how it gets oxygen right to where it's needed and gets rid of the CO2. It's like central to their success, but also it has some built-in limits.
Absolutely. And considering insects live practically everywhere, deserts, ponds, even flying, which takes massive energy, their breathing must be incredibly versatile.
It has to be. Understanding it, well, it tells us a lot about basic biology and adaptation, you know.
So where do we start with this internal air network?
Okay, the core concept is this tracheal system. Think of it like plumbing, but for air, running throughout the insect's body.
Air plumbing, I like that.
Yeah, it's a network of tubes delivering air directly to the tissues. So unlike us, their circulatory system isn't the main oxygen courier.
Okay, direct delivery. So break down the parts for me. What are the main components of this system?
It starts with the spiracles. These are little openings, usually along the sides of the body, on the thorax and abdomen.
Like tiny doorways for air?
Exactly. Air goes in through the spiracles, then into bigger tubes called trachea.
Trachea, got it.
And these tracheae branch out, getting smaller and smaller, eventually becoming tracheals.
Tracheals.
These are the really fine ones. They reach right up to, sometimes even into, the cells. That's where the gas exchange actually happens.
Okay. But these trachea, the bigger tubes, how do they stop themselves from just, squashing flat, especially when the insect moves?
Ah, good point. They have these reinforcements called tenidia.
Tenidia.
Yeah, they're like spiral rings made of cheat. Same stuff as the exoskeleton. They run along the inside of the tracheae.
So like the wire in a vacuum cleaner hose keeps it from kinking?
That's a great analogy, actually. Yes. They provide support to keep the tubes open, but they're spiral, so there's still flexibility. It's quite clever.
Very clever. And it ensures that direct path for oxygen we talked about.
Precisely. Straight to the cells, no blood middleman needed for oxygen.
So back to the spiracles, the entry points. You said they're openings, but are they just open all the time? That seems like it could be a problem, maybe for water loss.
You're right on track. No, they aren't just simple holes. They're actually more like valves. Muscular valves.
Valves, so they can open and close.
Exactly. Tiny muscles control them, regulating airflow in and out. It's crucial for managing how much air comes in, but also, as you said, for minimizing water loss.
That makes so much sense, especially for insects in dry places.
Definitely. Controlling water loss is a huge deal. And this control, it isn't just passive. The nervous system is actively involved, responding to the insect's needs, how much oxygen it requires.
So the brain is telling the spiracles when to open or close?
Essentially, yes, the central nervous system. And it gets even more specific. Spiracles can sometimes respond to local conditions, like if CO2 builds up in one area, the nearby spiracles might open up.
Wow, localized control.
Yeah, and some insects even have like little hairs around the spiracles.
Hairs? Why?
To create a sort of barrier. Slow down the air movement right at the opening. It helps trap a layer of humid air, reducing evaporation even further.
Fascinating. Okay, so air gets past the spiracles, through the tracheae, and down to the tracheals. What's happening right at that interface with the cells?
Right, the tracheals. These are the end-of-the-line, superfine tubes that get incredibly close to the cells. Now, often when the insect isn't very active, the very tips of these tracheals contain a bit of fluid.
Fluid? But doesn't that slow down the oxygen getting to the cells?
It seems like it would, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oxygen does have to dissolve in that fluid first. But here's the dynamic part.
Okay.
When the insect becomes really active, think about flight, for example. That fluid gets withdrawn back from the tips.
Pulled back. How?
The exact mechanism involves osmotic changes related to metabolic activity. But the result is the air-filled part of the tracheole gets much, much closer to the cell membrane.
So it shortens the distance oxygen has to travel through liquid.
Exactly. It drastically speeds up oxygen diffusion right when the demand is highest. And in really high-energy situations, like in flight muscles, those tracheoles might even push directly into the muscle cells themselves.
No way, like tiny air injectors.
Pretty much. It's an incredible adaptation for meeting extreme oxygen needs.
Yeah.
direct fuel lines for the cellular
So
engines.
that's really something. Microscopic tubes inside muscle cells. Okay, now I've also heard about air sacs. How do they fit into this whole system?
Ah, yes, air sacs. They're found in many insects, particularly larger or more active ones like beetles, bees,
Mhm.
locusts. Think of them as um, thin-walled, balloon-like parts of the trachea.
Balloons, so they can inflate and deflate.
Right. They don't have those rigid tenidia, or they're much reduced, so they're collapsible. They have several jobs. One is simply storing extra air, a reserve.
Like a little oxygen tank.
Kind of, yeah. It helps during bursts of high activity. They also help with ventilation.
How so?
By expanding and contracting, often helped by body movements, they act like bellows, actively pushing air through the tracheal system. This is super important during flight.
Okay, so they help pump the air. Any other roles?
Yes, a few others. In dry conditions, having that extra air volume means they can keep their spiracles shut longer, conserving water.
Ah, linking back to water loss again. Makes sense.
And get this, they can even help with molting.
Molting. How?
By inflating the air sacs, the insect can increase its internal body pressure, which helps it split and wriggle out of its old, tight exoskeleton.
That's ingenious. Using your breathing system to help you change your skin.
Okay, so insects aren't all just passively letting air drift in. There seem to be different styles of breathing.
Definitely. It varies a lot based on size, activity, environment, all that. Small, less active insects might rely mostly on simple, continuous diffusion. Spiracles stay open a bit, air just moves down the concentration gradient.
Passive breathing, okay.
But larger, more active insects.
Mhm.
They often use active ventilation, pulsatile, or cyclical breathing. They use their abdominal muscles to rhythmically pump air in and out, coordinating with spiracle opening and closing.
Like they're taking breaths, actively pumping.
Kind of, yeah. Actively moving air through the system. And then there's this really interesting pattern called discontinuous gas exchange cycles, or DGC.
DGC. Sounds complex.
It is, and it's common in insects like beetles and moths, especially those in dry places. It has 3 phases. First, a closed phase, spiracle shut tight, very little gas exchange.
Okay, holding their breath, essentially. Pretty much. Then there's a flutter phase. The spiracles open and close rapidly, letting in little bursts of oxygen.
Flutter.
And finally, an open phase, where the spiracles open wider, mainly to release built-up carbon dioxide.
Huh. Why go through all that?
The main hypothesis is, again, water conservation. By keeping spiracles closed most of the time during the closed and flutter phases, they lose way less water vapor. The open phase is just long enough to dump CO2.
So it's a trade-off, minimizing water loss, even if it means weird breathing patterns. But how do they get enough oxygen if the spiracles are closed so much?
Yeah, that's the puzzle. Probably a combination of lower metabolism during the closed phase, plus using oxygen stored in the system, maybe in those air sacs we mentioned. The flutter phase tops it up a bit, then the open phase resets things. It's efficient, but researchers are still figuring out all the details.
Fascinating balance. Okay, so let's zoom back in. Oxygen in, CO2 out. At the tracheal level, how does that swap actually happen?
It's mostly simple diffusion, driven by concentration differences. Oxygen concentration is high in the air within the tracheal tip, lower in the nearby cell because the cell is using it up.
So oxygen just moves from high to low concentration.
Exactly. It dissolves in that little bit of fluid at the tip, crosses the tracheal wall, and enters the cell. Carbon dioxide does the reverse. It's high inside the cell because it's a waste product.
And lower in the tracheal, so it moves out.
Precisely. It diffuses out of the cell, into the tracheal fluid, into the air, and then back out through the whole system. Tracheae, spiracles, gone.
And you mentioned earlier, size really matters here. Diffusion works for small guys, but bigger insects need that active pumping.
Right. For tiny insects, the distances are so short that diffusion is fast enough. But as you get bigger, diffusion alone is too slow to reach the inner tissues effectively.
So the limit of diffusion kind of puts a cap on how big insects can get using the system.
That's definitely a major factor, yes. Active ventilation helps overcome that to some extent, pushing air further and faster. But there are still physical limits. Environmental factors matter too, of course. Low oxygen in the air. They'll need to ventilate more or keep spiracles open longer. High humidity. Maybe they can afford to ventilate more actively because water loss isn't as big a risk.
It's such a dynamic interplay. Okay, changing environments. What about insects living in water? How do they manage breathing without direct access to air, usually?
Aquatic insects. They have some amazing tricks. Many have tracheal gills.
Gills, like fish.
Sort of, but they work with the tracheal system. They're usually thin outgrowths of the body wall packed with tracheae. Oxygen diffuses from the water across the gill surface and directly into the tracheal network. They mayfly or damselfly larvae.
Okay, so external gills.
Some have internal ones too. Dragonfly larvae, for example, have rectal gills. They pump water in and out of their rear end. Yep. The rectum lining has gills, basically.
Yeah.
Absorbs oxygen from the water. Bonus. Squirting the water out helps them jet propel themselves.
Wow, okay. Breathing and jetting. Any other ways?
Sure. Some, like mosquito larvae, have a siphon like a snorkel. They stick it up through the water surface to breathe air directly.
The classic snorkel approach.
Right. And then there's the plastron. This is super cool. It's basically an air bubble held against the body by really dense water-repellent hairs.
A permanent bubble.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
It acts like a physical gill. Oxygen from the water diffuses into the bubble as the insect uses up the oxygen within the bubble. It allows them to stay underwater for a very long time, sometimes indefinitely.
That is brilliant. Carrying your own air supply that refills itself from the water. Okay, and the opposite end, extreme dryness, deserts. You know about DGC, air sacs, hairy spiracles. Is that the main toolkit?
Yeah. Those are the big ones, yes. DGC is probably the most dramatic adaptation for cutting down water loss via respiration. The air sacs help extend the time between needing to open spiracles, and those spiracular hairs or other structures create that microclimate to reduce evaporation. It's all about balancing oxygen need with the absolute necessity of conserving every drop of water.
It really paints a picture of fine-tuning. So who's coordinating all this? Spiracle opening, muscle pumping, fluid withdrawal.
Is it conscious? Automatic.
It's primarily controlled by the central nervous system. It's mostly automatic, reflexive. Nerves monitor CO2 and oxygen levels and send signals to the spiracle muscles and the ventilation muscles.
So reacting to internal gas levels.
Yes. And as we mentioned, sometimes reacting to local cues near specific spiracles. Hormones also play an indirect role. They don't usually control spiracles directly moment to moment, but they regulate overall metabolism, growth, reproduction.
Which then affects the overall demand for oxygen. Exactly. So hormones set the background level of need, and the nervous system manages the immediate supply based on that need and current conditions.
A combination of long-term and short-term regulation. Makes sense. And this regulation has to cope with huge swings in energy demand, right? Like going from resting to full-on flight.
Oh, absolutely. Flight is incredibly energy intensive, probably one of the most metabolically demanding activities in the animal world.
So how does the tracheal system ramp up for that?
It uses all the tricks we've discussed. Air sacs act as bellows, powered by flight muscle movements, pushing air through forcefully. The muscle contractions themselves help squeeze and pump the tracheae.
Okay, active pumping gets supercharged.
And crucially, that fluid withdrawal from the tracheal tips happens, bringing air right next to the muscle cells. And as we said, sometimes the tracheoles even penetrate into the flight muscle cells.
That direct pipeline again?
It's the ultimate adaptation for delivering oxygen fast enough to fuel those incredibly rapid wing beats. It's really biological engineering at its finest.
It really is. Just thinking about the range, from passive diffusion in a tiny springtail to this high-performance system in a dragonfly. It's amazing. So, wrapping this up, what are the main things to take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just how different insect respiration is. This direct tracheal system, bypassing blood for oxygen transport, is fundamentally unlike our lung-based system.
Right, the direct air plumbing.
Yeah. And then there's the sheer adaptability of it, how it's been modified for water, for deserts, for the insane demands of flight. Plus the sophisticated control, especially those spiracle valves managing air and water.
Valves, gills, snorkels, air sacs, quite the toolkit.
Definitely. But also remember the limitation, this reliance on diffusion, even with active ventilation, does seem to impose constraints on how large insects can ultimately get.
A powerful system, but with inherent limits. It really shows evolution finding different, but equally successful ways to solve the problem of getting oxygen.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So here's something to chew on as we finish. We've seen how efficient and how limited in some ways this tracheal system is. How do you think insects might respond to big environmental shifts, say major changes in atmospheric oxygen levels or rapidly rising temperatures compared to animals like us with our circulatory systems? Something to think about in the incredibly intricate world of insect biology.